Hello and welcome to the third in the series of Hope Farm webinars to mark our 20th anniversary. The topic of this one is ecological intensification. First of all, I've got a few housekeeping points. This session is being recorded and will be available to view after the webinar. As this is a webinar, your video and audio have been disabled. However, you will still be able to use the Q&A box to put any questions you have. You'll find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. Please post any questions you have throughout the presentations in the Q&A box, which will be monitored by my colleagues, Sophie and Rebecca. We will then answer your questions at the end of the presentation. Please note that depending on time, we may not have time to answer all of your questions, in which case we will look to get back to you after the event with a response. So ecological intensification is the principle of letting nature do much of the farming for you, looking after the wildlife of the soil, the crops and the field margins to boost natural pest control and pollination. At Hope Farm, our original mission was to look at what impact we could have on wildlife by managing a proportion of the land for wildlife and continuing to manage the rest of the land conventionally for crop production. The stark results of these first 15 years speak for themselves. 3 times as many breeding red-list farmland birds, a much greater increase in wintering farmland birds, a 4-fold increase in butterflies, which seem to show no signs of levelling off yet, and bumblebee abundance is 19 times higher than a control site without the environmental features. Over the last 5 years, we have turned our attention to what we can do with the 90% of the croppable land that is still cropped, with a particular focus on soil management and integrated pest management. The biodiversity of the soil and the crops themselves is at least as important for nature recovery as the wildlife of the field margin habitats. There is also a beautiful synergy between regenerative agricultural practices to restore the ecological function and crop productivity. Our own contractor has found that managing the whole system to restore the soil, pollinators and natural pest control has improved its profitability. This is increasingly being seen as a mainstream activity. At AHDB's Agronomy Week last week, there was even a talk by Rothamsted about the benefits of having a diversity of short, slow-growing weeds in cereals. So tonight we have 2 speakers. Ben Woodcock will be talking about the ASSIST programme, researching how to feed a growing world population without causing unacceptable environmental harm. And Georgie Bray will talk about Hope Farm's participation in the project, looking at establishment and management of infield flower strips and cover crops. Without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. Ben is an ecological entomologist with the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. He researches management solutions to enhance biodiversity and ecological function into arable and grassland farming systems, particularly with relevance to agri-environment schemes. Ben is also principal investigator with the ASSIST project. For those of you who don't know, the first step of any research project is to invent a ridiculous acronym. And so to put you out of your misery, I'll let you know now that the alternative name for ASSIST is Achieving Sustainable Agricultural Systems, which doesn't even work as an acronym. But can you please direct any awkward questions on this to Ben? And on that note, I'll hand over to Ben. Do you want to join us, Ben?
Yeah, hang on. Just to point out, I am not the principal investigator on the project, but yeah, in case I get shouted at. Right, let me just share that screen. Can you see that? Is that okay? Richard, can you see that? Just so I can get some confirmation. Yeah.
Sorry, yes, thank you.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Right, so yeah, my name's Ben Woodcock, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the Achievable ASSIST project, Achievable Sustainable Agricultural Systems. Now, you've got a little bit of an overview there about what that's about, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. Now, this is a really big project. It's one that's being collaborated on between the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, where I work. Rothamsted Research is another big organisation that has had huge track record in agricultural research, and the British Geological Survey as well. Now, this is a big 5-year research plan, and its real focus is developing innovative farming systems that increase crop productivity and resilience to future threats, be that climate change, be that other impacts that may actually affect the agricultural systems that we rely on. Big part of this as well is how do we reduce the environmental and ecological footprint of agriculture? And that's a really cool thing. It's not just increasing productivity, but it's doing that in an environmentally sensitive way. So what do we really mean when we're talking about this? What we're trying to do is take those aspects of high input farming, the kind of conventional farming that most of you will be familiar with, and trying to integrate aspects of more low intensity farming, but that kind of farming system that tends to be very beneficial for biodiversity, to find which bits we can integrate, we can pull together to get the best of both worlds. Good productivity, profitability at the end of the day, and also biodiversity within these systems. So how do we go about this? How do we go about sustainable intensification? And really a lot of this I'm going to talk about here is the hows and the whys of how we do this. And a lot of this relates to outputs from the ASSIST project so far. So why do we think we can do this? Well, this originates from a big piece of research that we've done at the Hillsdon Farm platform. This was a 1,000-hectare site that up until about the early 2000s had never been in any agri-environmental schemes. This gave us a real opportunity to split this farm up and do an applied agricultural experiment where we established different habitat types. These is kind of fill margins, fill corners, creating semi-natural habitat that supports pollinators, supports natural predators, these kind of things. So we split this site up into 15 different little farmlets of about 50 to 60 hectares each. And on those, we either had cross compliance, that's no land taken out of production, a simple entry-level scheme, fill margins, fill corners with about 3% of land converted to those semi-natural habitats, and an entry-level scheme extra where we had about 8% land out of production. Now, this experiment was originally designed to look at biodiversity, but because we had detailed yield mapping over an extended period of time, we could look to see what the knock-on effects were in terms of yield. Now, I'll point out here that this is adjusted yield, taking into account the fact that we have removed land out of production. Now, there's one line here is a kind of parity in comparison to a regional average. So this is anything below that dotted line suggests that you're doing all right, but you're not really meeting the regional average. This is our cross compliance with 0% of land out of production. However, what we found was that 3% or 8% of land converted to those semi-natural habitats, we are getting a gradual increase in yield. It takes a bit of time for this to actually happen, but it does happen. And this is really good evidence. We also got other studies that have shown that it's the landscape within which farms are placed can also have a big impact on not necessarily their productivity, but their yield stability and their yield resistance, particularly to extreme event years like drought or really wet weather. Now, what we find is that in general, if you look across 10 years and we're using DEFRA data sets from here, we find what you might expect, the relative yield is always highest in landscapes with the most agricultural land. Those areas with the most agricultural land tend to be the most fertile, and so that's not a surprise. But what we find is that where you get areas of agricultural land in association with semi-natural habitats, you get that higher yield stability, that variability between years is reduced, and you also get more resistance to those really awful years, those bad weather years. So this is another indication that biodiversity can be integrated into farming systems to provide direct benefits. Why do we think this is happening? Well, this is a number of different things, and most of you will be familiar with this. The idea of natural pest control, invertebrates directly acting to control pest species. This is a huge economic value. Pollination is another one. It's a huge potential value worldwide, with up to 400 to 600 million valued within the UK. There's also other aspects such as soil services and soil regulation processes. This might be stuff like earthworms, but also microbial communities. And this can have huge relevance in terms of nutrient cycling, compaction, carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. The big problem is that we have seen large-scale declines in biodiversity. Now, this is a study that we did very recently looking just at pollinators, where we've seen a huge decline in both bees and hoverfly species from 1980 into 2015. These kind of losses have been seen for other taxa, And there's a good suggestion that this is the result of a range of different practices. So we need to find approaches to increase biodiversity in the context of agricultural systems if we're going to take advantage of the value of that biodiversity. Now, this is just to give you an idea that taxonomic biodiversity, just the sheer number of species, is not everything. What you're seeing here on the top is a honeybee, and in comparison to a solitary bee at the bottom. And you can see the difference in time these two species spend on individual flowers. Each species is functionally unique. It does a different thing. They cannot be considered to be identical. And those differences are crucial in understanding how they can help deliver these key ecosystem services like pollination and pest control. We see differences here between honeybees, bumblebees, and solitary bees, not just in the time they spend on flower, but whether they have dry pollen on the body and whether they make stigmal contact. And it's those two latter things that can be really important. If you don't have dry pollen on the body and you don't make stigmal contact, you're unlikely to get pollination to occur. What's really worrying is that if we look at national patterns of functional diversity, and this is just looking for pollinators, so bees that pollinate oilseed rape, we've got about 50 species of those in the UK, we have deficits in functional diversity that are highest in those areas of highest agricultural production. That is a really worrying thing. It's not just pollinators. If you look at predators, and this was a study that we did very recently, we looked at a wide range of species, and this is functional differences on a biochemical level, how their resilience to insecticides. We exposed them to pyrethroid insecticides, sublethal doses, so it didn't kill them outright. And we looked to see whether they were still able to predate, whether they were feed on aphids immediately after 1 day or 5 days after. And we see a range of responses. Some species are just unaffected. We get other ones that have a feeding depression. They predate on less aphids for immediately 1 day after, but they recover. And we get other species where we get that depression for 5 days afterwards. Now, that is really interesting, particularly as some of the species that are most abundant in agricultural land are the ones that suffer most from this sublethal effect. If you have diversity and functional diversity within your agricultural systems, it provides an insurance effect, averaging across those species to guarantee or to help guarantee that you can maintain the delivery of key services, in this case, natural pest control, even in conjunction with conventional management systems that use agrochemicals. We see the functional diversity is crucial, looking at a number of meta-analysis. Now, meta-analysis aggregate data across a wide range of studies, so they're a really powerful way of understanding the generality of effects. And we find that increased yield in oilseed rape and also improved predation rates by generalist predators is all related to functional diversity. It's also related to the crude abundance of individuals, but maintaining functional diversity is a key aspect of delivering these key services. So we need to develop and build on existing approaches to just integrate biodiversity with an intensive farming system. So this isn't necessarily reinventing the wheel, but what we want to do is develop new or manipulate existing approaches to enhance beneficial services provided by pollination and pest control and help management of soils and protection of water resources. This is all key components of sustainable intensification. One of the key problems is that arable agriculture is a destructive system. And effectively, each year it's harvested, you get a wiping out more or less of those systems. Even with stuff like minimum tillage, it's still going to be a problem. So we need to establish non-crop habitats so that each year these species can recolonize into the crops and provide those key services. Now, this has been shown to be really important for pollinators, where we've seen over the 20th century, there has been a 76% reduction in flowering plants that are crucial for maintaining those species. So the use of fill margins, fill corners, establishing those key floral resources has really proved to be a key element to providing what they need within the wider environment. This is true not just for pollinators, it's also true for a lot of predators. Now, a lot of people don't appreciate this, but a lot of predators need pollen and nectar, in addition to refuge habitats such as tussock grasses that you often find in fill margins. Parasitic wasps, for example, if they don't feed on pollen and nectar, will produce relatively few eggs and thus do not help to control pests. A big issue as well is this need to break up big fields. While we're quite good now at supporting populations around the field edges, if you've got huge fields, there's a real question as to whether or not they can actually get into the field centres. And this is what we see here. This is looking at bumblebees and a range of different sword active or flying predatory species. And what we find for both of these is the further you go into the crop, the fewest individuals that you actually find. Now, this isn't true for every predatory species or every pollinator, but it's true for a good number of them. So we need to develop innovative approaches to help maintaining those populations in field centres. This is part of the big field study that we're doing within the ASSIST project, and the Hope Farm is part of this, where we're comparing cross-compliance, where we're doing nothing to a field. We're comparing fields where we've got fill margins, where we were able to support populations around the field edges. And then also, and this is a kind of novel idea, it's a development of the beetle bank, but it's a slight modification, is we've got fields with these infield strips. And these provide basically runways, gateways into the field centre that have the potential to help support the influx of pollinators, natural pest control into the field centres. Now, this is very preliminary results from this study, but this is looking here, for example, at rates of parasitism of aphids. And what we find is that in that business as usual, where we don't enhance anything, we find that there's very few rates of parasitism. But as we go through this enhancement around the edges, but not getting into the field centre, it gets better. And also as we go into the final all singing, all dancing enhancement around the edges and these infield strips, we get higher rates of parasitism. So this is very preliminary results, but this is good indication at this point. We find similar things for predation rates of ground beetles. Here you can see we use little artificial slugs where we can look at feeding marks effectively to look at predation rates. Again, we find this treatment 3, this infield strips supports higher populations. We find reductions in the occurrence of slugs, and we also find an increase in the abundance of key earthworm species. So this is a really good indication that this is potentially working and having direct benefits for these species. So just to kind of provide a kind of overall summary in relation to this, I think it's really important to understand that when we think about agricultural land, a lot of the big increases in crop yields have already been obtained. Now, this isn't true everywhere in the world, but it is true a lot in kind of Western agricultural systems. They are highly intensive. They are making use of good agronomy. We have new crop varieties. We have highly refined agrochemicals. We have precision farming and new technologies such as that. So there are a wide range of different solutions that are providing small additive aspects that are helping to increase crop yields. What we're trying to suggest here is that biodiversity-linked ecosystem services provide an opportunity to add a new component to that toolbox for farmers. They are able to provide an additive value to the existing agricultural systems to help support them. We saw that in that very early slide in terms of the wider landscape. You get that yield resilience, but you also have that additive effect on conventional farming systems where you can help maintain pest populations lower for longer if you help do that. What's really interesting, as we also saw, was that it can take time for these biodiversity mediated services to increase. It doesn't happen instantly. You need to create the good habitat, populations increase, and then it gets better over time. So we need to find new mechanisms, as we suggested here, to fit biodiversity into agricultural systems, to find those benefits. And what we're really thinking about here is this idea of future-proofing agricultural systems. If we can provide those biodiversity, if we can support those key ecosystem services, then in the future, when you might have increased resistance to existing pesticides or removal of those pesticides, as we've recently seen with neonicotinoids from the market, you have the potential to provide a compensatory mechanism to help those management systems. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben.
Right.
So our next speaker is Georgie Bray, who's manager of Hope Farm. So Georgie is a third-generation farmer, having grown up on the arable farm family farm in North Essex. Georgie studied for a first-class zoology degree and masters at the University of Nottingham, studying bird ecology, nature writing, conservation genetics and conservation agriculture on the way. She started working with Hope Farm as assistant manager in 2017, working for a season on the monitoring of biodiversity and cover crops over winter across east of England and managing the communications work at the farm. Now, as farm manager, Georgie works with the contractor and agronomists for the farm's cropping work and manages the conservation, stewardship and trials groundwork, the communications and events and arable advice in relation to the farm. Back at the family farm, Georgie's works mostly appreciated as an environmental advisor, more recently enrolling them into the mid-tier of countryside stewardship. Georgie will share the farm's experiences in delivering the farm and conservation management at Hope Farm that should improve Hope Farm's ability to improve the sustainability of yields in the longer term. So over to you, Georgie.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Richard. So that was, well, I hope that you found that really interesting listening to Ben's talk. That was really an interesting insight to the sort of broad metadata and how things work on a much broader scale. So I'm going to try and bring this down to our experiences at Hope Farm, at the farm level, and how these things work in practice. So those things that we've got going on, we've got lots of other habitats as well, but the key things I'm going to talk about today are the wildflower margins, organic matter, so that being cover crops and our soil enhancement, so compost and later on chicken muck as well, and how cultivations have changed, the costs and benefits of these impacts on the farms with different approaches, and just looking at how there might be some real long-term benefits as well. There's the cost there, which at the moment you mostly see them are just short-term, but there's some really interesting legacy effects that we see out on the farm, and hopefully we'll see a lot more of as we do a lot more of this kind of stuff out on farm. So I'll start off with the wildflower margins. We've got a picture there in the top right, and that's our margins that are in treatment 3 of the ASSIST. So yeah, hopefully you'll recognise those. A real diverse mix going across a 32-hectare field and making that centre of the field much more accessible to the beneficial insects that we're trying to promote. And then there's at the bottom right there is just a the zoomed in version from the floor, just showing the diversity of different flowers and stuff. So for us, it's quite tricky to prove benefits to yield from invertebrates, although there's quite a lot of infield stuff we're doing that is suggesting these benefits. But using the principles that Ben's been talking about, we just try to practice them on the farm and see what a difference it makes at that scale. So we have 6.8 hectares of wildflower margins, which is 3.2% of the farm's area. The farm in total is 180 hectares in size, and 15 hectares of that is put down to conservation purposes. And we also have 3.2 hectares I've put there of legumes, but that's a pollen and nectar mix in countryside stewardship. And these areas we aim to provide habitats, make them as diverse as possible to suit as many species as possible, and really try and create as much of a balanced ecosystem out on the farm as we can do. And then by creating that balanced ecosystem, we aim to better enable it, if you like, to sort of tackle any pest invertebrates or disease and that kind of thing. So there's the pollinators, the soil dwelling invertebrates, so that's the ground predatory beetles to the worms, and right down to the sort of small things like springtails and stuff, all of which help us to grow our crops in one way or another, or the beneficial ones do at least. And then smaller mammals, which can sometimes be overlooked, but they're again great for slug control. And then of course birds as well. RSPB is perhaps an obvious thing, but that is one of our key aims. And yeah, as I said, it's all about diversity and connectivity, and that's kind of what the ASSIST project has taken things that one step further in the connectivity side at least. And I'm not going to spend loads of time on this, but this is just to highlight some of the key impacts that providing these habitats, putting 15% of the area down to conservation purposes, breeding birds up by 250%, wintering birds up by 1500%, butterflies up 400%, and our bumblebees are 19 times more abundant, or they were last year, when you compare that to a farm nearby that hasn't got the same level of environmental impacts. And actually, if you track our profitability as part of the shared farm agreement, which we run under, our profit from the crops alone has remained stable. But this impact it has on wildlife has been incredible. And we also have, thanks to the public funding available at the moment, the income from this countryside stewardship. So I've got here, do you get what you pay for? And you'll probably see as we go along, I've just picked up a few case studies, if you like, on the farm, and just things that I've noticed, not huge numbers of replicates, but literally just what we get to see out on farm in practice, and things that any other farmers in the room, you'll be able to go out and have a look at as well. And you'll probably be noticing on your own farms. So yeah, not all margins are made equal. These three margins are on the left-hand side. It's actually a field that was put down to pollinator resources. They were either drilled in 2018 autumn or 2019 spring. The picture in the middle there was 2019 spring, and the ones either side in the autumn of 2018. And I took this photo on the 29th of May this year. I haven't put a poll up, which is a shame, because it would be interesting to see what you guys thought of this. But on the left-hand side there, by the end of May, there were a few oxeye daisies, so a few pollinating resources, but it was not very diverse in the types of different resources it was providing, and there weren't that many of them, but it was still providing habitat. And the key thing with this is as well to just highlight the fact that flower margins, they get better through time. So some of our best margins are 15 years old. So they take a long time to get going anyway, and that's just the nature of them. But the quicker we can get them going, and the quicker we can provide an abundance and diversity of resources, the quicker positive results we'll get. And then the margin we've got in the middle there, loads of oxeye daisies, but again, it hasn't got that much diversity. Whereas the one on the right there had loads of different plants in there, from umbellifers to the red campion. You can see quite a lot of oxeye daisies. There was a little bit of self-heal coming in. There were loads and loads of different plants within year 2, which we were really chuffed with. Of course, all different parts of the farm vary slightly, but we do have a quite uniform sort of heavy clay soil. But the level of inputs did change actually between these areas. So I've got basic here, better and best in this table. And then I've just got the level or the amount of money that we spent per hectare on the seed mixes, establishment, first year cuts, annual autumn cuts, and the total annual cost. So I averaged these costs over a 5-year agreement, which is why the cost of the seed mixes might look a little bit low per hectare. As this is averaged over the 5 years. And that's the same with the establishment costs and the first year cuts. I averaged that over the whole 5 years. And then I've got there the countryside stewardship income, which at the moment that will be the same regardless of, as long as you do have a wildflower margin there. All 3 of these would qualify for countryside stewardship income, or they do. But the basic, which is the left-hand side one, we used a slightly cheaper mix. It was still a good mix, decent, and we drilled it into a relatively good seed bed, and we had 2 years of cutting in the first year, because that's what you want to do to keep the annual weeds under control. And then in the second year we were able to just do a standard cut and bale and then remove the cuttings, and we need to do that on these heavy soils with high nutrients, just to try and keep the nutrients down so that the flowers can keep remaining competitive against the grasses. And so that's cost us an average £390 a year, and we get a countryside stewardship income of £539. So that's quite a reliable income for us. And the better, which is the middle, that had a more expensive mix, a greater diversity of wildflowering plants, and that was established in the spring into a slightly better seed bed actually. And that was cut twice in the first year again, but with that slightly more expensive seed mix and perhaps a slightly better seed bed meant that we had better flowering resources even though it was drilled in the spring. So it's later on. So that cost us £500 a hectare. So we're only making £39 from our countryside stewardship in the 5-year agreement. And then this final one, it actually received over and above the requirements in terms of annual year cutting. We had, again, that expensive mix established in the autumn, which is ideal for us, into a really good seed bed. And we had 5 cuts in year 1. So that's in 2019. And by year 2, it looked amazing. And I was really impressed, well, thanks to our contractor and his work as well, that it managed to get this kind of diversity so quickly. But we're actually making a loss on that if we're going by countryside stewardship income. This is part of a trial, so we wanted to get the results quickly. But yeah, I hope that just piqued some interest with you. Next I'm moving on to is cultivations, organic matter and legacy effects at Hope Farm. So looking at a few fields out on farm and then a trial as well. Last year, and indeed this year, was a really tricky year for establishing winter wheat or winter cereal crops. This is like our key profit making crop on farm, but we have to wait until quite late in the drilling season to allow weeds like blackgrass to chip before we can drill, to avoid running into serious problems later in the season. Unfortunately, last year on most of the fields, by the time we'd left it for the blackgrass to chip, it was really wet. And actually, if we'd have travelled across most of the farm, if the tractor hadn't have got stuck, it would have seriously damaged the soil. However, there was one field that, well, and that just kind of shows really, out of 80 hectares that we planned to drill, we only drilled 5 of them. And then we had to other things instead in the following year. But the 5 hectares we did get to drill was one of our consistently better performing fields on the farm. We were able to travel on it. When we drilled it, we were able to direct drill it, and we have been able to for the last 4 years. And the soil just looked more resilient. And actually, when the drill ran through it as a direct drill, there were so many insects about. So this is a devil's coach horse here, great predatory insect for helping control pests, but there were loads of worms, there was other beetles, caribids, there was loads of stuff just alive in the soil. One key thing about this field is consistently the best performing. We've been able to direct drill it and maintain good soil health better than the rest of the farm. It had only turned to arable land 40 years ago, and previously to that, it had been grassland. So that's just, hopefully we'll plant some ideas there. And then this is another thing that we're doing as well, is looking at cover crops and compost and how they may impact soil health as well as biodiversity. We have got some results that show that there is a positive impact on biodiversity, at least for some species. But this field here in particular was quite interesting just to see the impact of cover crops and compost on our ability to grow oilseed rape, which is across the country an increasingly troublesome crop to grow due to pests and disease. Across this whole field we've got here, in 2019, we had the drought in the summer. There were flea beetles across the whole field. We didn't use insecticides though, and there were pigeons using the field as well, to be entirely honest. And this NDVI map, which shows the amount of green biomass on the field, was taken from May of the harvest year. We had 4 different treatments on this field and 3 other fields. But you can see we have cover crop on the left-hand side of the field and compost on alternate corners. So we had compost alone and then a cover crop and compost treatment, and then we had a control. And when we walked the field, there was the same level of flea beetle larvae pressure across the whole field, but the control near crop failure, that was about 0.5 tonnes a hectare. We were losing money on that. But then where we had a cover crop grown, we were making reasonable money, 4.5 tonnes a hectare on those darker green spots, but averaging sort of from the compost cover crop and compost of 2.5 to 3 tonnes a hectare, which that's fine, that makes a profit for us. And that's without using insecticides as well. And the soil looked better. And this is just the impact that we had on biodiversity. So I won't spend loads of time on this because it was spoken about in the previous webinar, so please do catch that. But you can see here on the left hand side all of those letters that they're birds and different species, and you can see there were more birds using where the cover crop was compared to the fallow. And then on the left hand side is a graph that was put together by Olivia Martin, a master's student. And cocoa is cover crops and compost, com is compost, con is conventional, and cov is where the cover crop was. And this is across all our trial fields and looking at the number of bird species. So where we had the cover crops, again, you can see we had a greater number of species using those areas. So when I said about legacy effects and the previous smaller winter wheat field, this is just another one looking at legacy effects, and this was taken in 2018, a spring wheat crop. Again, really hard drought year. I'll be completely honest, it was an awful crop, but it was a really tricky year. And you can see here, you can almost draw a zigzag line through the middle of the field. And the right hand side was a paddock until about 40 years ago. And then the left hand side, that has been in an arable rotation. We've got maps from the 1850s when it was an arable. And there is something very different about the level of biomass in April 2018, so how strong the crops were. And you could see the difference from the ground as well between the right hand side and the left hand side. And that zigzag line in the middle, that matches up with where the hedge line is. So there's something going on there. Adding organic matter more than we bargained for. So when we've been adding organic matter, I'm looking at compost now. Does it improve structure, soil above ground and below ground biodiversity, better for organic matter, macro and micronutrients? Well, this is the list of micronutrients where we've noticed increased levels, where we've been using compost, and cover crops have had an impact as well. And I'd say, yes, the soil structure in the fields where we've been using cover crops and compost looks better, just from visual getting the spade out, having a dig. And the graphs that I showed you previously looking at the bird diversity, I hope that gives an indication for how the above ground biodiversity is doing as well. And this is just taking data that is from Frontier's SOIL soil service. So we got this on top of our every 4 years basic macronutrient analysis across the farm. Doesn't cost too much, but it gave us a really interesting insight where we'd been using the compost and the cover crops in those quarters of fields over the last 5 years, what the differences were between them. So phosphorus, sodium, manganese, potassium, boron, zinc, and organic matter all had increased levels where we'd been using that compost. And the organic matter in only 5 years, we've got some differences there of 2% between compost and conventional, and that's massive. I don't know when we would reach a saturation point, but I feel like to get to that difference, it makes a big difference. So this all comes at a cost, of course. Cover crops are £30 a hectare. Compost we've been adding every year in these trial areas for 30 tonnes a hectare, which adds up to £375. A key cost there is transport. So I think that's a lesson to anyone who's looking to put organic matter on the farm. Look for a place that is nearby to you, whether it is cattle. We've got chicken manure that we've added in there that is much cheaper partly because the transport is so much less, and the spreading as well, because we don't need to put so much of it on. But if we're trying to use this organic matter to sequester carbon and reduce the farm's footprint, if we're having to drive miles and miles to pick it up, then it's making life much more difficult, and it's making life more expensive as well. Having said that, that £375 a hectare, if we're looking at the difference between 0.5 tonnes a hectare of oilseed rape and 3.5, 4 tonnes, that's still worthwhile. With the chicken manure as well, there are savings on nitrogen inputs, and with the compost and the chicken manure, we can save on our NP and Ks as well. Our Ps and Ks as well. So I've whizzed through that, but I hope that sort of gives an indication of when you're looking at the habitats, so your wildflower margins and other habitats as well, they can benefit the farmer, and Ben's talk was a really good indication of it. But if you can really take the time and put those inputs on, it pays dividends earlier and you really get that habitat delivery. Adding organic matter, it has got high short-term costs. So going back to these here, it's a big commitment to pay that sort of money. And I don't expect to, outside of trial, it would be much harder for us to justify the £375 a hectare if we didn't know the input, the benefits we were getting straight off. But when we're looking at fields like that field of spring wheat, where we're still having positive impacts 40 years on, and potentially with that winter wheat field, the fact that we've been able to drill winter wheat might have been because it's got that soil resilience and the benefit from it being a paddock for as long as it was. It's really hard to quantify them, but I think it justifies why we need to be focusing on these kind of inputs on the farm. Managing for the long time is tricky, especially when we don't know where payments are coming from in the future. But the more we can do and the more we are able to start to put these kind of things into the farm business plan, the better. So that is the end of my presentation, and thanks very much, everyone.
Right, thank you, Georgie. So now we move on to the question and answer session. So Ben, would you like to rejoin us on video?
Yeah.
And for all of you watching, can I remind you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to pop your questions in, and we'll start with the questions that we already have. So Sophie, can you read out the first question, please?
Yeah, I certainly can. So one of the first questions is, are the yields higher mainly because of natural pest control on the crops?
Okay.
It's an aggregated thing. So the issue with the Hillsden study, which is one of the first studies that's kind of showing the long-term benefits actually at kind of field scale crop yields, that's aggregated over 3 crops. So that's winter wheat, oilseed rape, and field beans to a certain extent. So it's not just one crop. The biggest effects that we see were for pollination, but you also like to see an effect for natural pest control. The issue with natural pest control at the moment is fundamentally insecticides are cheap as chips, and why wouldn't you use them? Because they're cheap. Going into the future, so it comes back to this issue of future-proofing farming systems. If you want to have those resources, those natural pest controls to help maintain populations lower in the future, when there's likely to be increased restrictions on either the number of active ingredients that you can apply or direct removal, or increased issues with resistance. I mean, you only got to look at kind of BYVD and the aphids and the pyrethroid resistance. You've got to look at neonicotinoids now being removed. Having a kind of game plan or a B plan of how you're going to help maintain your profitability in the long term is a crucial aspect to doing this. So at the moment, if I'm honest, you know, a lot of these ecosystem services, you know, it's tentative. You know, it's like some years they're really good, some years they're not. It's not an every year is a winner. But if you're looking into the long term, you need to have a solution. For example, if you are not planning for the removal of glyphosate as one of your agrochemical toolboxes, you probably being a bit optimistic. You need to have these ideas going into the future of how you're going to manage these systems. And natural pest control provides a way of doing that. So yeah, I would say it's an aggregative effect. The benefits is more orientated towards pollination in conventional systems, but I suspect where you have great restrictions on insecticides going into the future, it's more likely to be swayed towards a natural pest control.
Okay, Sophie, have you got the next question?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of questions come in about cutting of the flower margins. So the first one is that Georgie mentioned 5 cuts of flower-rich grassland and if that is really necessary. And the second one was about whether we generate any revenue from those hay cuts, from the strips in the field. Do we use them on the farm or sell them and therefore save the cost?
Okay, Georgie, for you.
Yeah, sure. So The 5 times annual cuts, I think in countryside stewardship, so those were margins that were as part of the ASSIST trial. In countryside stewardship, it actually says up to 4 times. But the margins that we had going through the middle of the field, we wanted to keep as short as possible. By keeping the cuts short, it really reduced the risk of annual weeds, which are quite a problem on the farm, germinating and seeding. But also we didn't want the vegetation getting above 10 centimeters in height, otherwise that's going to be a really attractive habitat for skylarks, and we didn't want to be providing a really good attractive nesting site for skylarks to then mow them down. So that's another reason why we did the really regular cutting. We haven't got a intermediate for say 3 or 4 cuts, so it's quite hard to tell the difference, but at least in that case, having those really regular cuts and really knocking back the grasses, that really helped. In terms of what we can do with the cuttings, that is a problem that a lot of farmers come up with. So there is, up in Lincolnshire, Nicholas Watts, he actually manages to sell his cuttings as hay, which is a really good use. Ours, we have a few bits and bobs and plants which mean we wouldn't rather not sell ours as hay. So although not much, there is the odd ragwort plant which writes that off. And so one thing that we're looking into this year is seeing if there are any digesters or AD plants that might take the cuttings, because that could be quite a nice way of closing the loop. At the moment, they're just composting on farm.
Could I just add a bit to the frequent cutting is often vital in that first year to help control kind of competitive dominance of weed species. If you don't do it, you tend to see the effects in subsequent years. So it's that first year of establishment is crucial. You've got relatively high fertility often, and it's just controlling that till the fertility goes down a bit, and the species that you spend money on to sow can actually establish to some extent. So you tend to see the benefits in subsequent years. Generally speaking, these wildflower margins look awful in the first year. You know, they're kind of ridden with weeds, and you know, if you let them go, they need that harsh management.
Yeah, we have done it before where we've only done I think it was we left until sort of May time to do the first cut around the edge of the field, and there was just too many thistles there, and it was starting to get and black grass coming through as well, and it wasn't attractive. And then for this ASSIST trial, it was difficult because there was loads of crimson clover coming through and it looked fantastic, but you're not aiming for resources in year 1. It's all about aiming for getting the resources by year 2.
Grand. Okay, Sophie, have we got another question?
We certainly do. So what is the distance approximately between the on-field margins or beetle banks?
We do 3 boom lengths, so somewhere between 96 and 108 meters, depending on equipment. That relates more to studies that we've done looking at pests, where we basically artificially established aphid colonies on wheat plants in fields at different distances, and look to see, when you have field margins very close, where the drop-off was in the effect of natural pest control. And we start to see it around kind of 50, 60 meters. So it's kind of anecdotal evidence. I mean, it's experimental, but it's, you know, anecdotal from kind of one particular study. But based on that, we kind of came up with this 3 boom lengths distance. So obviously, the more boom lengths you have, the less productive land you've got taken out. The closer they are, the more likely you are to have this spillover, but there's, you know, you're losing so much land. So that was kind of the middle ground area that we saw. I mean, we've got people now who are seriously considering, in addition to these infield strips, where there's wildflowers, using them for an agroforestry component. So that's something that some people were initially very interested in, but it was hard to talk people into the wider kind of experiment.
Can I just ask then, in relation to that, is the variability between species or groups of pest predators that in terms of how far into the crop they can effectively cover? And are there actually ways in which you can design margins to benefit the beneficials over, well, the most productive beneficials, as it were?
Yeah,
Is it that advanced?
Yeah, fundamentally, species differ. They're not the same. You know, species richness is a great indication, but different species do different things. If you are talking about ecosystem service provision, it like pest control and pollination, it tends to be the very abundant things that are most important, because, you know, if you're talking about eating aphids, having lots of one species that eats aphids is more likely to be important. It's one of the reasons honeybees are often quite important. If you're near a hive, there's a lot of them. They're not necessarily the best pollinator per unit individual, but when you've got a lot of them, they can be really, really important. So different species do different things. Different species move into crops in different ways. It's not the case that all predators have a drop-off going into fields, and the same with pollinators. Some species distribute quite well. Parasitoids are a good example of this. They tend to be patchy, but they tend to go all the way to the field. So there's these general kind of differences. And yeah, you can target crops. So the assist margin was specifically designed to move beyond the kind of pollen and nectar mix, which probably a lot of people, if you're a farmer at least, you're likely to be familiar with, which is very much targeted towards bumblebees. Now, the idea behind that is, you know, these are quick plants, you know, a lot of clovers that establish very well. They do well in quite high fertility soil. They produce a big flowering resource. Problem is if you've got a bumblebee, even the short-tongue species have relatively long tongues compared to a lot of other species. If you're talking about, say, hoverflies, which are pollinators and provide natural pest control, the larvae do, or parasitoids, or all these things, they need open flowers. So we're talking stuff like umbellifers, stuff that they can actually get into. So you can specifically target seed mixes to help support particular resources. And that's one of the things that we've kind of been looking at. It's this idea of farming biodiversity for its direct benefit. So it's not that biodiversity isn't important in its own right, but it's how do you take advantage of that biodiversity to integrate into farming systems.
One of the great things with umbellifers as well is there's loads of cow parsley that wants to just romp away alongside hedgerows. So the more that you can do, just leaving that scruffy edge as well, that's going to be providing a fantastic resource for things like hoverflies, which they're pollinators, but then the larvae are brilliant at eating aphids as well. So it's a real win-win.
Yeah. Grand. Okay, thanks, Sophie. Have you got another one?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of questions coming in about the use of compost. So one of them is, what kind of compost are you using? Do you make any yourself or buy it all in? And would you need to add less compost over time as the soil improves? And so the cost would be less the longer you've been doing it.
Okay. George,
yeah, sorry, I jumped in there. So I'm glad that you mentioned compost, Sophie, as it's something that I needed to speak more about in the presentation. But we source it from Envar, so they are a local composting plant, and we actually buy the compost. You can get it for free, but one of the key issues that we run up against with compost is contaminants. So compost has a load of potential because it's basically taking things from the green bins from houses at home, and what would otherwise go to landfill, it then actually is recycled and then can go to provide nutrients for us to grow the crops. Brilliant. But the trouble is a load of other stuff is chucked in as well. So we went over to the plant that produces this compost, and the amount of, shoes, plastic, everything under the sun is thrown in alongside the really good stuff. So we have to pay that extra money to get the source as clean as possible. But there are still the odd contaminants in there, even though it's getting better. So I think that's a message to the public to say, the more you can actually put things in the bin that are meant to, the easier it's going to be for us to access this stuff and recycle it properly. The next part of the experiment, so we've been running that field trial for 5 years now, and we're switching over the compost treatments, and we're now using cover crops across the whole field. And in 2 years, we're going to revisit and do those soil tests again. And we are running basic biodiversity monitoring across the fields as well, so birds. And it will be really interesting after 2 years of the switch over and 2 years of not applying compost. It would be brilliant if that, I think there is some research that's been done by Rothamsted about how long the benefits can last in the soil, and it's quite a long time, but I can't remember the exact numbers off pat, I'm afraid.
There's so much variability between soil types in those kind of things, breakdown rates, and kind of, yeah, there's a lot of site context specificness, so it's tailoring it to your individual site conditions, and ideally, you know, backing that up with kind of soil monitoring, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, we're heavy clay soils and varied cultivations, and that's only to name a couple of things that are going to have an impact.
I mean, the big thing with organic matter is how close you are to a source of it, because it's not the cost per se, it's the transport that kills you, you know. So we had this, a big one of the ASSIST experiments involves adding organic matter, and depending on which site you are, it's free to incredibly expensive if you're a long distance away, either green composted waste or kind of manure based organic matter. And it can really work out, but it's that polarization of agricultural systems over the last 50, 60 years, where we've gone to predominantly arable farming systems or predominantly grassland farming systems, and that's removed that opportunity for every farmer to kind of have that. But it's an important thing, exactly what Georgie was saying in her talk, even the visual benefits that you see from it.
I think one thing that this is at home, our little farm at home rather than Hope Farm, but we're being paid to take away muck heaps from stables, which is one option, and the payment for removal helps to contribute towards the spreading costs, which is one way that we could look into as another diversity of organic matter. And of course, every different source provides different things.
Okay, Sophie, any more questions?
Yeah, so I've got a little bit of a complicated one here. So it says, really interesting results from the recent pasture land. How do you maintain those healthier soil systems as you move to arable crops and the loss of host plants for mycorrhizal fungal networks?
Georgie.
Yeah. So the key principles that we're trying to practice is keeping a green cover as long as we can on the field, and again trying to add in the organic matter that we might be taking away by growing the crops. And so we've incorporated the straw for a long time, but the impact that has on our farm at least is quite small. And I think in other cases it's been shown that has a very small impact. It still helps, but it won't have nearly as much of a beneficial impact as the actual addition of organic matter. And we're reducing our cultivations as well. So a few years back we tried to make the transition too quickly, perhaps, from a full tillage system to no tillage, which brought up its own problems in a heavy clay system in terms of compaction. And so we've had to sort of reinstill some of the cultivations, and we're now slowly reducing our cultivation. First off, using cover crops where we've got spring cropping in, and just this year we've moved to having cover crops where we've got autumn sown crops in as well. And then we'll layer on top of that, once we've figured those systems out, or feel like we've figured them out better than we have now anyway, we'll be adding in companion cropping and other layers on top of it as well. So it's changing one thing at a time, from a system that we know works in one shape or form to one that basically taking lots of lessons from regenerative agriculture.
Okay, Sophie.
Yeah, so this one says, I presume there is a difference between the benefit of infield margins at the sort of 96 to 108 meters for ground predators, such as carabids and staphyloids, versus pollinators. Do field margins need to be closer for predators as opposed to pollinators?
Yeah, well, we've chosen the distance probably for a greater focus on predators. That's, as I mentioned before, that kind of drop-off distance. We often see it for a lot of the generalists around the kind of 50-60 meters. Pollinators are by definition a lot more mobile. The thing that you get with big fields is it's not that having a flowery strip running through the center of 40 hectares of oilseed rape is going to provide more floral resources for them. It's not. They are fundamentally attracted to the oilseed rape. They just don't tend to go that far into those kind of fields. What you find with a lot of pollinators, however, is they like to follow linear lines. So field boundaries, field edges. So they actually use them more. So the fact that there is a height differential between your oilseed rape crop and your infield strip means that they will still follow those into the middle of fields and then move in. So it helps with that kind of permeability. But yeah, there are differences. Bees are fundamentally, well, they have lots of beetles have wings as well. Lots of predators have wings, but they do tend to be a lot more mobile. There's also a trade-off as well. So honeybees forage over huge distances. Certainly 5 kilometers is not uncommon. Bumblebees are pretty mobile, kind of 2-3 kilometers. They forage over. But when you get to stuff like solitary bees, they're a lot smaller, and the 500, 750 meters. Now that's their maximum foraging ranges from individual nests. But in terms of fields, again, there's a diminishing return for them going right into the middle of fields if there's floral resources at the edges. So these infield strips get them into the middle of the center. Well, that's the idea, and that's one of the things that we want to test in ASSIST. We're not going into this with the assumption that it does work. We actually want to test it and identify whether we find those effects.
Okay, so we're sort of up on time, but if Sophie's still got more questions, I think we can go on for another 10 minutes if people want to hear more.
Yeah, I definitely do have more questions. So one of them is, what were the cover crops used in the trials?
Yes, we use cover crops. It's principally oats, as I recall. There's a variability. Different people were using different types, but we did tend to kind of oats and mustard. That was my recollection. So it's been quite a while since we established these. I don't know. Can you remember, Georgie, on the
Yeah. So for the ASSIST trial, it's a mixture of some black oat, phacelia, 2 different clover species, daikon radish and mustard. I think there might be another radish in there as well. When we first started the cover crop and compost trial 5 years ago, we just went for a basic mix of having black oats and phacelia. So you had the 2 different rooting systems where you had the deeper tap roots of the black oat, and then you had the sort of the finer surface roots of the phacelia, but without having the radishes. We didn't have the sort of mustards because we were slightly worried about running into issues with having oilseed rape in the rotation. But we've now moved things on now where we've got a much greater diversity, and we found that the black oat runs us into troubles when we're establishing spring cereals afterwards, because there was quite a high component of that. So ahead of spring cereals, we now go for a big biomass crop with linseeds, radishes, and then a small amount of black oat, and then lots of phacelia and mustards as well. And that's in the autumn. It's brilliant as well, because if it's flowering, it's providing some brilliant late resourcing pollinator resources, having all those flowering species in. And yeah, so that's kind of the approach that we're going to for mixes now, a much greater diversity.
Grand. Sophie, have you got any more?
Plenty more, Richard. So one of them is, what would you like to see from machinery manufacturers to assist in cultivation or maintenance of infield boundaries or other intensification measures?
I'm happy to answer that.
Yeah, Georgie, go for it.
So one thing we've looked into a bit, so with the flower-rich margins, we have to, in as many years as we can, remove the cuttings to keep that nutrients down. And it's always, it feels like a shame almost that in September you have to do it so that we have enough time to get the cuttings in the right condition to bale them. When there are still flowering resources out there, but if we leave it too late, then we can't get on the margins whilst it's dry enough without damaging them. So there are machines out there that I think councils are using that are really expensive, where you can literally cut and collect as you go along. They're big bits of kits and they're really expensive. And I guess with some sort of farm sharing, that would be possible. But if there's a way that that kind of machinery in that kit can be more readily available, then brilliant.
Grand. I think we've got time for one or two more, Sophie.
Lovely. I'm not sure if we'll know the answer to this, but to what degree do ivermectins used for treatment of animals and which get through into manure have an effect on soil invertebrates if manure is used as a nitrogen source?
So ivermectins and ivermectins have a massive effect on dung beetle communities. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that it might have an effect. Are you aware, Georgie, of any studies that have looked at this? I'm not aware of anything that's specifically seen that as a potential risk, but yeah, it's certainly not beyond the realms of possibility because they've got established effects in dung anyway. So it depends a lot on whether the source is, because if it's a topical application, it tends to spike and go down quite quickly, the ivermectins, and so the impact's not so long. But if they're using bolus-based treatments, there's a kind of more continual background level that can be maintained in the dung. So, you know, there's a lot of variability, I suspect, between where you're sourcing your kind of dung from. But yeah, it's not an impossible risk, certainly.
This is where I'm really going to show up that I need to be more aware of RSPB stuff going on outside of Hope Farm. But there was some research, wasn't there, Richard, on choughs?
Yeah.
Yes.
So it is a known issue that ivermectins and ivermectins do have a very dramatic impact on the availability of invertebrate food for species like chough that feed on grasslands, grassland invertebrates. And indeed, more recently, research has shown that the alternatives to ivermectins can be very damaging as well. And ultimately, a sort of integrated pest management for livestock vet meds is probably, you know, just as important in livestock sectors as integrated pest management in the arable sector is for arable land. So looking at sort of clean grazing and where and when you use pesticides for parasites is the way to go, basically.
Well, there are quite a lot of sort of routine applications of it, isn't it? Where it could be heavily reduced.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's definitely there are integrated techniques to minimize use. Yeah. Okay, probably got time for one more, Sophie. So we've got a quick one.
Okay, if you are applying for a higher tier wild pollinator and farm wildlife package, one of the qualifying criteria is having 7 of the 13 wild bee species associated with the wider countryside. Where can we find the list of the 13 bee species?
So I'll be honest with you, I don't know the answer to that myself, but I know who would, and that would be the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. So you could check with them. Has anyone, or has anyone else got an answer to that one on the panel?
I don't know off the top of my head. It strikes me as a largely bullshit list of 13 species because there's quite a lot of bee species associated with agricultural land. I suspect they've largely picked it out of the common ones, but yeah, I agree with you. Bumblebee Conservation Trust should be the people to check. Or
I was just going to make a plug for, if you go on the Farm Wildlife website and ask, that's a good way of accessing advice from Bumblebee Conservation, but also other wildlife conservation societies as well. They have an advisory input into that website, so it's quite yeah, if anybody else has any other questions like that.
I mean, to be honest, so in terms of recognisable bee species, I mean, if they're talking about bumblebees, there's only like about 6 common species, isn't it? Widespread species. So I'd imagine probably all of them.
There's 6 species that are relatively easy to identify to kind of clusters, but within that there's a load of aggregates. So those are the ones you can kind of do for colour bands. They're a hard group to do. They're, you know, it's one of those ones where it's superficially quite easy. But in terms of the solitary bee species, you know, your average person is not going to be able to identify solitary bee species. They're, you know, they're not straightforward to do on the wing, full stop. You need experts. So I mean, I'm not familiar. Sorry, I'm not familiar with that list specifically, but I've got a strong suspicion in practical terms, it's not that easy to actually do. But I'd agree, the obvious ones are the common bumblebee species, of which there's kind of 6. There's a dark one, ruderatus, that is kind of a 7th one. They're kind of relatively easy to do. Then you have the honeybee as well. So I suspect it's those 7 that they're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Well, perfect timing. I've got an aeroplane flying over as I aim to close this. So I think we've run out of time, but I'd like to remind anyone who's still got unanswered questions that we will respond to you after the event. Thank you for all the questions sent in. I'd just like to start closing remarks with a summary of what we've talked about this evening. So I think we've heard a good case for creating and managing habitats for wildlife to benefit agriculture, and the best ways of supporting the functional biodiversity that will benefit agriculture is a topic of current research, and we've heard a lot about that tonight. So the biodiversity restoration can be a critical new tool to support yields alongside agronomy, new varieties, new chemicals, and precision farming. I think Hope Farm has demonstrated that it's able to restore wildlife and maintain profitability, and obviously the Hillston project right at the start of the sort of the CEH work in this area has also demonstrated that, you know, it can be a very profitable way to approach things. The experience at Hope Farm says that sometimes patience is needed to reap the rewards, and maybe that should be reflected in the way that grants are designed and compliance is checked. There's also a link between soil health and biodiversity, and demonstrates that there's a good synergy there as well between environmental management and wildlife conservation, which some people see as kind of conflicting aims. But at the end of the day, I think there is good merits in seeing the wildlife value of the farm management holistically. Can I remind you that the recording will be made available to watch after the event, and a link to access this will be sent out in the follow-up email. If you wish to get in touch with regard to any follow-up questions, then you can email Ben or Georgie. Their email addresses, I think, are on the slide that you can see now. And if you have a spare minute or so, could you please fill in the survey at the end of this webinar, which will pop up in a few ticks when we close this webinar. We would find that particularly useful. And finally, I would like to finish by thanking both of our speakers again for their wonderful and thought-provoking talks, and to all of you for joining us this evening. Hope you found it useful and worthwhile. And until the next webinar about insecticide-free farming on the 27th of January, it's goodbye from us. Thank you very much.